Well, hi everyone. This is Pedro García from Ask and Wonder. This is the show where Christians and skeptics come together to talk about the biggest questions in life. And so today we're very excited. We're going to be interviewing Dr. Ian Hawkins, and he is a biochemist from Welch College. How are you?
Good, man. How are you?
Good to see you, Ian. Thank you very much for spending time with me. So
Thanks for having
today's topic is going to be science versus scientism, how science became a worldview. And so before we tackle this topic, I would like to say to you guys that, first of all, you are always welcome to subscribe to Ask and Wonder. This is exciting, the fact that I'm going to be interviewing Christians and skeptics from different fields: philosophy, science, ethics, pastors, and secular thinkers about the biggest questions in life. And also would like for you to become part of the conversation. You can send me an email to askandwondernashville@gmail.com, and I'll share this information with you in the description of the video below. And also know that this conversation, besides being a YouTube video, is going to be a podcast episode in Ask and Wonder, the podcast. So you have two options to listen to it. Know that there are very exciting opportunities and interviews coming up in the future. And also the last thing, if you consider that these conversations are important and we're supposed to have them more often, then consider becoming a patron and support Ask and Wonder. Your help is helping me a lot to have time and put my heart into these conversations and train to be ready to interview these amazing thinkers. And before we start the conversation, after a very interesting conversation I had during my last interview, I just would like to share a statement with all of you. Of course, I'm a follower of Christ, and my heart is, of course, I was a former atheist, and now I gave my life to Christ. But the reason why I do Ask and Wonder, the main reason is not to convince people that God exists. It's because I wanted to create a place where people come together and they can actually talk and say whatever they want about any of these topics. So we welcome critical thinking, and we welcome also emotions and feelings, because that's part of what being a human is. So as a host and founder of Ask and Wonder, I welcome any type of conversation, and I'm excited to what is coming in the future and for you to be part of it. So after I said all of this, now we're ready to start the conversation, Ian. Okay, well, Ian, thank you very much for being here. And the first question I would like to ask you is, would you tell us a little bit about you and what you do these days?
Yeah. It's a little different than normal. Everybody. So I teach full-time at Welch College. Basically, I'm the department chair there for the arts and sciences, but also oversee really the science programs. So I teach actually quite a few classes in our biology major, and we have different nurses and stuff. So that's sort of what I do on a daily basis. Obviously, mostly teaching from online now with the COVID virus, but yeah.
Yeah. Did the situation with COVID-19 change a lot your work and the way you communicate with your students?
It did, yeah. It obviously, well, most schools, most colleges across the country actually moved to some online, format. Really about March, really about most of our spring breaks, and just kind of waiting to see, what's going to happen for fall. We're obviously planning. Most schools are planning for students to come back, but we'll sort of have to wait and see how the summer goes.
I understand. Okay, well, I hope everything goes back to normal soon. But I guess that one of the things that I'm hearing now, Ian, is that summer, it seems that because of temperatures and because of getting used to the fact that there's a virus out there, we're just becoming more comfortable with it. That could be a good thing and a bad thing at the same time. But it seems that the autumn, right, fall and winter, that is going to be an important time for this virus as well. Is that right?
It seems that way. I mean, I'm not a medical expert. I follow kind of the research and what's going on behind it. And honestly, they don't really know about when outbreaks will occur because of the way the spread works. And obviously it's happening, in warmer climates like Brazil and things like that, even right now. But I think most experts think that our biggest danger is probably going to be fall and winter for that second, wave if we get it. So hopefully we don't, and most of that just has to do with the fact that when people are inside, it's easier to spread because you're in close contact. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing that, Ian. Okay, well, so we're going to start talking about science and scientism. Let me say something before we start, how interesting this topic is. It's just so, when I became a follower of Christ and I started reading about philosophy and science and philosophy of science, and then I realized that there's a small sector of scientists in the world that, of course, have a worldview, and this worldview entails just a specific reading of what the data that they receive from science. It was very interesting to me. But before we go there, we'd like to know a little bit about your background. Ian, have you always been a Christian?
Yeah, I grew up, became a believer early in life. I guess if you could call me a typical Southern evangelical upbringing.
Yeah.
I grew up in North Carolina. Actually went to a Christian school, and obviously went to church, and became a believer when I was 5. And then I went through, typical stuff that kids go through with faith too. And then actually when I went to university, went to a secular university, and all throughout my training. So I did undergraduate at a secular college, and then my master's and PhD were all at secular schools. So that was sort of when I was really, challenged in many ways. In graduate school, when I was at Vanderbilt in graduate school, I went through a pretty serious, time of doubt, really kind of wondering if all the stuff that I'd sort of put my faith in was really real. It's probably a 3-year, long kind of struggle, and sort of came out on the other end of that. I'm still a believer. But it definitely opened my eyes to questions, got me more interested in being able to answer those objections. How can I personally answer those objections? Obviously, mainly, but then what kind of answers do we have for our having faith? And so that's sort of my faith journey, and that doubting period really changed my perspective a lot about Christianity and how to approach it and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Were all your doubts concerning the scientific method or concerning science, or?
Yeah, most of them were not actually. Interesting. I mean, I've always sort of, I don't want to say struggled, but there's always questions that go on, and it's still a learning process when it comes to the scientific and how science and Christianity relate. That's what I'm probably the most interested in, what I spent probably the last 5 or 6 years of my life studying. But no, not really. Early on, it was mostly, can we trust the Bible? Is it historical? Kind of really more along the lines of kind of, I guess you could say, biblical apologetics. Like, really, is there any reason for us to trust at all what we, Christianity, is sort of apart from science? And then I sort of came back around to those types of questions. They were always there, but yeah. Okay.
Well, Ian, so let's start talking about science and scientism. And the first thing to do, it would be fair, first for me and also for the listeners and viewers. How would you define, let's start with defining these terms. How would you define science?
Yeah, so I looked it up to make sure I get like a dictionary definition, and then I'll try to give us a working definition.
Yeah.
So Webster's dictionary basically defines science as kind of a system of knowledge or a type of knowledge. In fact, and I don't want to get too deep here at the start, but really the ideology, so where the word science comes from is actually kind of interesting, and it plays into this, so maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later. But basically, science comes from the Latin word that actually derives from the Greek word that Aristotle originally used for demonstrable knowledge. He called it episteme, so epistemology. So science basically is the same word translated. So in its sort of simplest form, it means knowledge. But obviously the working definition, like how we use it as a scientist, is really more of a process by which we go about learning knowledge. In fact, that's I'm actually about to teach a summer class here. In the book I'm using, that's how they define it. Like, that's sort of the working kind of textbook definition, is that science is sort of a process by which we go about to accumulate knowledge.
Okay. It seems that also and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems that science was a word in the past used for actually philosophers and also scientists, people that would also try to understand natural phenomena. It wasn't only about logic and, right?
Yeah, and that's where that word kind of comes from. So, in fact, so the word science, as we know it today, defining this type of this subject matter, you could say, really only has its origins in the 1800s, about the middle 1800s. Before that, they were, most scientists were known as natural philosophers. And the word, like I said, the word science really just means knowledge. So, like, I mean, some of you may have heard the quote, like, theology is the queen of the sciences. And people always think, well, that's so strange. But that's because the word science means knowledge. So in that particular setting, in that particular case, what they were saying was that theology was the queen of knowledge, of the art of sciences. And so, and then there is a distinction there. We can talk about this a little bit later too, that there is, so science means like demonstrable knowledge, like things we sort of just know by experience, but not something that we can perform. Like a performance, like music or art or even technology, actually is a techne knowledge, is a different type of knowledge. Like something that you perform or do is one type of knowledge. Something you have or you can demonstrate, kind of like book knowledge, is what science really, the word comes.
That's interesting. Never stopped to think about that the implication of technology. That's very interesting.
Yeah, and this is where so arts and, like, it's so odd. Why do schools call it arts and sciences? It's because it's demonstrating the two types of knowledge. Art, the performance knowledge, being able to perform something, and then science, meaning the demonstrable type of knowledge.
Wow, interesting. And then we get to scientism. Some people would be thinking at this moment, scientism, what's that? What is it, Ian? How would you define it?
Yeah, it's an interesting word, and one that's actually come up quite a bit. So I looked at a couple of different definitions. Again, Webster's definition sort of just says scientism is the sort of I'll see, I'm trying to think of a good word to use. An over-exuberant trust in the process of science, the subject, the scientific method, to give us all truth. That's sort of the hardest definition. I looked up one. So Tom Sorell, who's a philosopher of science, was quoted several places. His definition. He says that scientism is the belief that science, especially natural sciences, is the most valuable part of human learning. It is the most authoritative or serious or beneficial way in which, we can create valuable knowledge as part of learning. That's sort of another good one. Is scientism is the promotion of science as the best or only objective means by which society could determine some type of normative or epistemological value. So the only thing we can know for sure is what science can tell us. Everything else is really just opinion and hearsay. That's really sort of the hardest thing.
And then it could entail also with all these definitions that science would be our only source of knowledge. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. In the sort of simplest, like, I guess what you would call, sometimes people refer to this as hard scientism. Like that would be a good definition.
Wow. And when do you think this worldview started to emerge, and from what sector of scientists did you start seeing this type of system of thoughts, or perhaps worldview, started to emerge?
Yeah, really interesting question. And in fact, it's probably one of the more interesting ones. There's an article I pulled up a couple of days ago by Thomas Burnett, who used to be the head of the Templeton Foundation, if you're familiar with them. He wrote an article for the American Association of the Advancement of Science, so which is the standard body in America that promotes science, the sort of lobbying body, and they do a lot of work promoting science education. And now this article he wrote was his opinion. It's not representative of the AAS, but he does a good job, and maybe I'll put a link so people can read this for themselves, but he does a good job of sort of explaining all this, the historical background, and sort of just to kind of try to briefly get to it. So really since the Renaissance, this idea of knowledge, how do we know what we know, so epistemology really, started to obviously gravitate toward reason. If you go back to the ancients, so Aquinas and the Middle Ages, the medieval period, they talked about like two books. You've seen this sort of reference several times, Revelation and Reason. And of course, Revelation, obviously, because many of them were Christian or Christian background, obviously. And so you kind of see this dichotomy, and it plays out in the Renaissance, where reason sort of gets elevated, and there's many philosophers that could be involved. Francis Bacon, who really is the father of sort of the methodology, that was his big push. Can we make science, or natural philosophy at that point, a methodology so everybody could follow that? Then it's followed by Descartes. And, I mean, you just keep going on. And then, of course, we get to where it sort of gets abolished. So Hume sort of does away with reason. So then Kant comes back and says, no, we need reason. So there's sort of this big debate about what reason actually is. And this starts to, the whole point of this really is to elevate reason. And so this is where scientism comes from, but it's not really sort of birthed until really the 19th century. At the beginning of the 19th century, there's several guys who are involved. One in particular that's mentioned obviously in the article is Auguste Comte, who was a philosopher in France, and he proposed what's known in philosophy as positivism. Mm-hmm. This is the idea that basically, really, that the natural sciences can answer everything. And what Comte basically did was, in essence, try to take the scientific method and apply it to the other side of human living. So we knew that many people, and I still believe that the scientific method is wonderful for understanding physical things about the world. It's perfectly valid and fantastic. But then when it's being applied to things that it's not very good at, you sort of get in trouble. And so Comte was trying to do that. He was actually known as the father of sociology. So he was trying to apply scientific methodology principles to explain human culture, values, morality. And so this plays out all throughout the 19th century, and then it sort of rebirths in the early 20th century. And really it sort of has its heyday about the 1970s, when scientism as a whole is really, really promoted. And actually probably since then, it's had some difficulties, specifically in philosophy and history of science. Many sort of trained scientists, still believe this. I mean, throw out some names: Krauss, Peter Atkins, Richard Dawkins. Many of these people maybe don't Peter Atkins and Krauss definitely do. They come right out and say it. I haven't heard Richard Dawkins specifically say it, but every quote he says is basically kind of the same thing as scientistic view, that all we really can know is what science can tell us. Mm-hmm. Anything out of that really is just opinion.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I was thinking as you were talking, when saying that, for example, scientism is the only way, science, the scientific method is the only source that we have in order to gather information, let's put it better. The only source that human beings have in order to know in reality what is out there, and the rest of the things that you said, it's just opinions and,
right.
I'm just thinking about, there's certain assumptions about this, right? For example, when someone says science is the only way to get knowledge, I'm thinking that there's two presuppositions there. I would like to ask you about these two. The first one is that I believe in the validity of sense experience. Like they need to trust that is going to happen the same way, and that actually that is a way to acquire knowledge. And then there's also another belief that is entailed there, which is the uniformity or regularity of nature. Like there's an expectancy an expectation that the laws of nature are going to be the same at all times. What thoughts do you have about those two?
Yeah, so let's take the first one. So
Yeah.
science about sense experience.
Yeah.
There's an interesting sort of connection. Philosophers have been debating this issue for a long time about, what can we know? Can we trust this? In fact, all the people I mentioned, Descartes, Locke, Hume, Kant, they're all kind of trying to deal with this. Like so how can we trust our sense experience? Can we trust it? What can we trust about it? And science actually has some interesting, points about this that's funny. So one of the things that we know, even in some scientific laws, a good example of this is that the Earth is moving really fast and spinning on its axis. Now, when you think about it, this is a normal belief for us to have. Science in essence has proven this, right? But this is not from sense experience. None of us walk around feeling as if we're moving that fast. In fact, this goes back to this sort of Copernican and Galileo debate. That was one of the things they had against them. If the Earth is really rotating around the sun, wouldn't we all feel it? Obviously it's not. And so there's some interesting, my point is there's some interesting issues with the idea of just saying sense experience actually tells us about reality.
Yeah.
We even know this with vision aspects too, that our vision can sort of, trick us in some way. So that's the one side.
Mm-hmm.
The other side that I'll mention too, maybe you can ask me about the second point. I can't remember it, but
definitely.
The other aspect about this particular statement, so a scientism statement, which has really caused it to fall out of favor in philosophy of science, is that it can't be supported by its own, by science itself. So it's basically self-refuting. So if you say that the only thing we can know for sure is what science can tell us, or the scientific method can tell us, well, that itself is not provable by the scientific method. So you basically run into two problems. Either you agree that statement is true, but it's not science, so therefore something outside of science can be true because that statement is not scientific. Or it's completely self-refuting, meaning that you can't prove that statement at all by scientific method, so therefore it's invalid. So either, you get stuck. Either you agree with the statement and you're saying that there is something outside of science that we can say is true because you can't prove that statement by the scientific method, or you automatically say that statement is invalid because the scientific method can't prove it. So.
It is truly not a good start for scientism at all, when actually its definition itself is actually self-refuting,
Right.
Itself.
And that's where philosophy, has a benefit that it comes into play because it points out an issue, a problem with the statement that you make, that many times scientists don't, know this. I'll just share this as a side note. One of the most interesting things, which has really got me interested in this whole subject to begin with, is a few years ago, I started reading more. Scientists are not philosophically trained, nor trained in history. And I started reading more about the philosophy of science and the history of science. And what fascinated me the most about these subjects is philosophers of science and historians of science were much more likely to value the relationship that religion has with science, whereas most of the scientifically trained people did not. And it's because of that, I think, that issue that you see that, and this is what people have to realize, mostly scientifically trained people, I'm not good at, don't ask me history questions outside of science. Don't ask me to perform, a concerto on a piano. We're not good at anything else. So you sort of have to, most of us are. I'm just saying we're not experts in other fields. So to ask a scientist, an expert about philosophy or history, unless they've really studied in that area, it gets tough for us. And so we get sort of tunnel vision and don't realize what else is going on. Around us.
Yeah, sometimes I'll be completely honest with you, Ian, and with everyone, and I'm always to be corrected and to hear more opinions. But for certain scientists that seem to be incredible, actually, let me not say seem, they are incredibly smart. But the facts that they take for granted the such huge presuppositions when they come to the laboratory as supporters of this worldview, scientism. Like, for example, mathematics and the laws of logic. That's a presupposition that they haven't invented. They're just using them because it works.
Yeah.
Then this last interview I had, we talked a little bit about reality, and what he was telling me is that, reality was kind of overrated. You know,
Yeah.
it was very interesting, and of course we didn't have time to expand. I'm sure he has a very interesting views about the topic, but it comes to the point where you see. You as a scientist, Ian, you go to the laboratory and you're studying, for example, a cell and all the mechanisms that exist there. It seems that people use the analogy of mechanisms in order to talk about cells.
Sure.
So we see all those things. If we start creating patterns, oh, this is what it does when this happens in this context. It acts this way. So we have completely described what a cell does. But then when you finish doing this, you end up having this a problem. You haven't explained what a cell is objectively. So you see what I mean? There's
Yeah.
a whole huge thing. We have a brain, and that brain is a given. And we have a reality out there that's also a given. So what is happening with the beautiful scientific method, that it comes to a point where, of course, there must be something else for human beings to find meaning out there. What do you think about all of this and line of thinking?
Yeah, it's an interesting point and sort of where we're at. I mean, well, let's make it a little, I'll try to make it as practical as I can. So let's
Yeah.
just use COVID-19 as an example, as a case study, right?
Yeah.
Because I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I think it's sort of the whole virus issue presents kind of all these problems kind of into one. So, the pandemic, what's happened with the virus now. Is science important? Absolutely. Like, what can science tell us about COVID-19? It can tell us what it is. So, what does it do to the human body? Why does it cause death? All the, the epidemiology, what transpires in the human body as they deal with it. It can answer a whole bunch of questions about that. But you see in our across the globe, not just individual cultures. So now we're talking about just a global idea, like, what do we do with the virus? Well, now that's a question that science is really not good at answering.
Mm-hmm.
And what's funny is we do that automatically, right? We do that automatically and don't really think about the fact that, like, science is very limited in the ability of it to answer those types of questions. So let's just say, so one of the problems with COVID-19 is the science hasn't caught up. Like, we don't know everything about the virus. And that's, when I talk to people about this who ask me, that's one of the things I first say, like, you have to realize we don't know all the answers yet scientifically about this problem. So the methods that we're using to try to help with the virus, we're going off just what we know. So there's a limit there as far as, but even if we entered the situation and knew everything about the virus, there's still questions that science can't answer, right? Like, so how many deaths are too many? Like in other words, so when is it bad for us to close all the business? Like, at what point is the death rate high enough that we should close all the businesses and hurt the economy? Or at what point should we, science cannot answer that at all. Even if science could say, listen, if you do this, this is how many people are going to die. If you do this, like, we're not even at that point, but let's just say we were. You still see that there's a difficulty there in answering those questions, and science can't answer those. And this is where I think scientism sort of runs into the problem, it is those types of questions that most people sort of don't think about. Like, when you're in the lab, those kind of questions don't really come up because you're trying your best to sort of figure out what's going on. And you get tunnel vision. I mean, I did sort of 10 years worth of graduate work, far too long. But when you're in the lab, you're really focused on the problem that you have. And so, you're not really thinking about, other issues, I guess. How does this play? What type of things am I doing? It does limit your vision and understanding kind of where science is limited. And rightly so. I mean, science has been super successful, right? I mean, we all sort of live with what science has accomplished, but I think COVID-19 kind of just is a good, helpful point that there's a limit, and we have to make decisions not based on scientific truth. So what do you do there? If the only truth we know is scientific, but now you've been asked a question about whether to open or close the economy or how to handle people or culture, and science can't answer that. Now you're in a whole different, type of question and type of inquiry.
Yeah, that is. So, yeah, I have so many questions. This is so interesting to me.
All right, I'm gonna turn on my light talking here.
That is okay. I guess I would go to. So when you talk about these questions that science cannot answer, and we need to get these answers from other venues or other realms of thoughts or the human hearts.
Sure.
Where or how do you call those places or those sources of information? Where do they come from? Like, for example, when we talk about ethics and morals and all of this, those can those be quantified the way we quantify information through the scientific method?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, now people have tried to sort of, like I said, I mean, this is really, to be frankly honest with you, this is sort of the last sort of, well, there's several issues, but they kind of all play in together, where science, in essence, is trying to sort of, if we can find more information in science to fulfill these types of questions, and morality is one of those, then science would reign supreme, right? If science can answer questions about morality or consciousness or, those types of things that still bother us on a regular, or I shouldn't say bother us, we interact with it on a regular basis, right? I mean, we interact in a society about how we should live. And that's kind of the other side of that. And that's what, as I said before, that's what sort of Comte is trying to do. He's trying to take the scientific method and see whether he can pull off a morality or explain, not really pull off morality, explain why humans do what they do. And so if we can do that, then we can sort of, as I guess robots, if we can figure out why people do what they do, then we can just create a society to help people do what we want them to do. That's sort of kind of where it goes, where he's talking about it in sociology. And he mentioned, this is really interesting. So Kant mentioned this whole idea of progressive thinking, that we're progressing better and better and better. He basically says that that history, human sociology, human culture, basically evolves through three stages: the theological, the old one, what he calls the metaphysical, where basically instead of using God, you just trade God for certain terms, I guess, like, it's not God holding things together, it's the law of gravity, whatever. I guess that would be an example. And then eventually to what he calls sort of like, he doesn't really call it scientism. He used the definition positivism, but basically, like, we have no use for anything metaphysical, like out there. We can just explain everything. It's just ad hoc, like that's it's descriptive. It's not anything else. But the difficulty that science has had over the last 200 years since he proposed the idea is it seems bankrupt. Now, I mean, in the next 100 years, what information comes out, who knows? But in many of these cases, we're not any farther along. We're not any farther along in science creating a morality. In fact, so let's just use another practical example. Sorry, I'm keep going, but
no, please.
So the whole idea of race that we're dealing with now in our country and around the world, right? So let's just ask ourselves, okay, about race, what does science have to say about that? Well, it's interesting, because to be honest with you, I think if we were honest, and some of the scientists are pretty honest, that if you follow an evolutionary paradigm, racism is a natural outcry of that. Because if any creature, if any organism is continually evolving, right now we don't know what that's towards, so we could be careful about that. Like, who's to decide who's to decide what's better in evolution, right? We could clearly say that. But if evolution is true, that means some of us are going to evolve and survive, and others of us are not.
Yeah.
And it could fall along racial lines. I'm not saying it would necessarily, but my point is, and in fact, we've known this historically, and Darwin was actually concerned about this, but after Darwin's theory, many people took that and ran with it. In fact, historians have even pointed out how Hitler and the Nazi regime used some of the evolutionary ideas in their thought about, sort of, the betterment of society. And if you look at America's, background, eugenics, I mean, in the early 20th century, we were clearly, they basically going around making people infertile. I mean, in a program sort of way. And that's really dangerous. Now, that doesn't mean to say that science says that. What I'm saying is that science either doesn't say anything, or science can't really give us value of human value across the board.
Yeah.
Now, people have argued that we're all made of DNA. Well, that's true, but so are all organisms. So why don't we give value to every living? So it goes back and forth. But I think, and some people now are pointing this out, not scientists, but are talking about these values, that these have to lie outside of what science can tell us. I guess I said a lot to really say there's a dichotomy in our society right now for what we value. What we value and put forward is equality. That's a big thing, equality. Science does not deal in equality. And so you're at this sort of, tension here.
Yeah.
With what we want society to be like, science can't provide a foundation for. And so, where else do we go for that foundation?
Yeah, many things and many interesting things there. One of the things that you said made me think about. So you were mentioning how evolution, if evolution is true, then talking about morals and ethics and how, for example, our atheist friends say well-being and all of this, like the meaning of all those words become kind of ambivalent a little bit. But in terms of evolution, actually evolution itself, it's just it's a mechanism that does something. When people say that this mechanism entails that life should be lived this or this way, that stopped being science. So many of the neo-Darwinists that use evolution to say that there's no God, I mean, you cannot use evolution to say that, because it has been demonstrated how many scientists and Christian thinkers accept everything that the theory of evolution is presenting, and they actually see it as a way in which everything is progressing to a final goal. So it seems, Ian, that let's just touch briefly on this, this is a very interesting topic for me, how the theory of evolution has become, inside of scientism, I think there is evolutionism, which seems like there are many answers when we don't know something. Like we have the God of the gaps, which is, so if we don't know anything, then God did it. Then it seems that we have that conversation with evolutions. If we don't know something, then evolution of the gaps. This is because of evolution, and it happens this way and that way. And it's interesting for me, because when analyzing this as an ignorant, I mean, as a student, I don't know what I am, but I'm not an expert at all. But I just see there's a mechanism, and there's some certain, let's put it this way in simple terms, materials, and there's a mechanism, and this material does something. That's it. When it comes to meaning, when it comes to what happens after that, when it comes to the reason why there's this material with this kind of telos, with this kind of purpose of doing something, there's nothing we can do. There's nothing we can say. And that's why evolution is incredibly open to for a Christian worldview to step into it and say, yeah, this could be a beautiful way for God to have created the world. But Just a comment about all of that. You have any thoughts about evolutionism, and all of this?
Yeah, I mean, it plays into it. Probably the biggest thing about evolution that plays into all these debates. I mean, I would probably point people to Alvin Plantiga, who's a well-known philosopher, wrote a book basically really about the subject that we're talking about, and he basically says the debate between religion and science has nothing to do with science, evolution in particular, and all that, but it's really naturalism, which is part and parcel, I guess, with scientism in many ways. And then you kind of point that out. I think the difficulty with the two sides, I think, is really that issue. Like, in other words, is evolution. So most scientists, like who are trained, who are trained only in the sciences, would probably say that evolution requires naturalism. In other words, it because they'll talk about it in those terms, like random, accidental, like no guidance, and that is, it is a metaphysical statement, right? That's absolutely true. And so that's I think is where the rub is, that most people, the way they understand evolution means unguided, undirected, and that one in many ways, unguided, undirected, except by natural law, right? Obviously, is guided by survival of the fittest, although that's probably a bad term to use, but that gives a general idea there. So yeah, it sort of falls in there, and Plantiga does a pretty good job explaining kind of this debate is happening. But you make a good point. I mean, the one thing that's interesting to me is, like, when you talk about religion, especially Christianity, I mean, Christians have had every view about evolution that you can possibly imagine. So evolution or no evolution is not really a science religion kind of debate topic. I mean, it's presented that way, and there are people obviously who have problems with evolution, but I'm just saying that's not really the problem with it, because there are or Francis Collins was just interviewed a few days ago on Unbelievable, and talks quite a bit about, he believes in evolution, and actually formed BioLogos, which is a Christian organization that talks about that. So
Well, that is very interesting, Ian. I would like to tackle a little bit about kind of, let's say, I don't know if it would be fair to say the opposite of scientism. I actually wouldn't say this, because from the Christian worldview, we can find meaning in different areas. Scientism just says that there's just meaning in only one, or, the only source of knowledge. So in my conversations, I've been very lucky, because I've had conversations with incredible thinkers, both Christians and non-Christians. I actually always, when talking about, with scientists, when you have all the data, and you have the laws of logic, mathematics, and presuppositions, and mechanisms, and patterns, and a reality, and a brain that is able to understand it. You have all of this. So when it comes to the atheist perspective about this, and of course, this is generalizing. There are people that won't think like this way, but for the sake of the conversation, we have mathematics. Why? Well, we don't know. We have the brain. And why is it there? We don't know. And it is okay that we don't know. We have reality. We have the universe. Why? Well, we don't know. So we have all these pieces of evidence. I don't know. So it seems that there's a how do you say this in English? A cumulative case of a lot of evidence there. This. And then the skeptic says, we just don't know. And I wonder, Ian, as we progress in, let's say, in 300 years, we're going to be discovering new things about reality. And I think that the point of this is that they're going to keep saying, I don't know. And I ask always this question to them. I am a follower of Christ. What do you think, after having this case of having all this data, if I come to the conclusion that there is a God behind all of this, do you think that this is irrational? Do you think this is a far-fetched idea? This is something that perhaps it could be possible? Or this is one of the most rational things that you have ever heard? And usually the answers for this from secular thinkers and scientists, they say far-fetched or completely irrational. And I would like to ask the question to you. You have all this data, reality, you exist, existence, consciousness, mechanisms, patterns, the cell, things that do things. And now you have all this evidence. You put it together and you say, okay, this is pointing towards something. And this something is a creator. And there's another gap there that we fill as Christians.
Yeah.
There's a special revelation, but let's just stay with the gap of, from all this cumulative case, I jump towards the conclusion, there is a mind that created everything. What do you think about that jump? Do you think there is a fair jump for a person when it comes to analyzing all this evidence?
Oh, I mean, I do, but obviously,
But yeah, I really want to know your opinion, definitely, about it.
Yeah. I mean, I have some presuppositions, obviously. I mean, I grew up and influenced by a Christian family, so I mean that makes sense. But in general, I think you really sort of have it in some ways two sides about this. So one is well, look at all the stuff that scientists have figured out. And so I have faith that science is going to figure out the stuff we don't know. And I did use the word faith.
Yes. I noticed.
On purpose. Whereas, and to be honest with you, I would say truthful scientists would agree with that there is a faith aspect to going from science to atheism, like what you were saying.
Yeah.
Jumping that gap. And I think we're sort of all of us are stuck with that. Like all of us can, no matter how much I mean, if you're like Nobel Prize winning physicist, or you work down at the local grocery store, however deep your knowledge goes on a particular subject, right? Doesn't really matter. You're kind of stuck in that point where you have to take a leap of faith at some point. And so I think it's rational, mostly because I think where scientists sort of get in trouble many ways is because of scientism, that they won't call it this, but they will only take scientific arguments as valid, like stuff we can talk about and debate. And it doesn't mean those arguments aren't debatable, because we could debate them. I mean, the beginning of the universe, the anthropic principle, all the sort of things that are given for, what you talked about, mathematics and, all those things. Like we can debate some of those issues. And so I don't think they have a problem debating the things in science. I think the problem where they get in trouble is they don't agree about looking anywhere else but there. And I think that's what sometimes gets them in trouble. Well, I wouldn't say in trouble, but sometimes limits their scope of what type of evidence they're looking at.
Yeah.
I mean, a good example, like I've heard Richard Dawkins, debate people like John Lennox, and he hardly ever talks about history.
Mm-hmm.
Like in other words, it's almost like that's not even valid. It's not even worth my time spending talking about. I've never even heard him talk about whether he sort of mentions like some historians, but that's all he does. He never actually gets into a real conversation about whether or not, the Gospels are historical or anything for that matter.
Yeah. So
my point is he's already eliminated. I mean, even if you give it a lower problem, let's say you think that history only gives you 20% truth, but he's completely eliminated any type of conversation about it. So that's, I think, what typically tends to happen with scientists, and this is where scientism comes into play. They may not call it that, but it's kind of embedded in what we do. Like, okay, we'll have discussions and we'll have arguments with you or about it, but we're only going to stick to the science. Yeah. Like we can't talk about anything philosophy and that goes back historical, and so that does limit you.
Yeah.
In thinking about these issues. But it's been interesting over the last 30 years to see some of that change.
Yeah.
This is going back to a little bit of history, and I guess I say since I'm a scientist, I don't really know history, but you can look it up and see if I'm right. But when Darwin published his book, one of Darwin's big proponents was Thomas Huxley, and one of Huxley's biggest pushes was to elevate science over the other disciplines. And in fact, that several schools were started around this time to be basically, in essence, only scientific schools.
Mm-hmm.
And what is caused in the universities, and you can see this historically, especially in American universities, there's a big divide between science and the other disciplines and humanities, all those things. And that's, again, that cultural divide. Like, we don't really care what culture is doing. We only can be sure about what science tells us. And so this has been a really big divide, and now it's starting to sort of, there's been some movement to kind of help the disagreements that have been going on for a long time. And I don't know if you, I mean, obviously you came from a sort of a music background. I don't know if you experienced that, but
well, one thing you're saying, Ian, for sure, if it's not God, it's going to be something else. We're going to be worshiping whatever, whatever we think is going to be the source of our, it could be science, it could be theology, it could be Christian apologetics, it could be everything. So definitely, and you can see that happening a lot in human.
Yeah, and I was reading it's interesting. I was reading the article again. I'll send you a link so people can read it.
Yeah, we could share it in the description.
Yeah. So Thomas Burnett talks about the fact that, so in the French Revolution, which is right before the 19th century, he said there was so much push to make science the religion. In fact, and Kant talks about this specifically. This is where scientism comes from, the religion. They literally would shut down Catholic churches and have what they called a worship of reason. So they would have services basically elevating reason and science. And so it's sort of a long-standing kind of debate, like sort of what you were mentioning.
Yeah.
And most people don't realize how much this has had an effect on, really on the university itself. I mean, I'm lucky enough really to work with at a small enough school that I sit around with. I mean, there's only a couple of us that are scientists, or natural sciences on the faculty. And so, I mean, I'm always sitting around history people and English and psychology. And so, I have to talk about things other than just science, which is helpful to me. But there really has been, unfortunately, this dichotomy between the sciences and the humanities. Art's not useful anymore. What does it tell us about, So it really is interesting to see this debate has been happening, and that's what I mean, going back to your question. Like, we sort of have to take all areas of knowledge, and yes, it could be that we are more certain about certain areas of knowledge than we are others. That's quite possible. But to just eliminate any form of understanding or knowledge strictly because it is not following a scientific methodology, I think, does a disservice to, it does a disservice to other people who are studying.
Yeah, you're right.
Peter Atkins, I think I told you this before, but Peter Atkins had a debate with John Lennox, I guess a year ago. And in his opening statement, he said something I just don't, he basically said, if it's not science, if we can't do it scientifically, then I don't think it's of any use. And what fascinates me about that type of statement is, like, but you cannot live that way.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is your interactions with your family are governed by the scientific methodology. No way.
Yeah. Or
your interactions with your colleagues are governed by the scientific method. Like, we don't do that. And so saying that and then actually living that out is really, it's impossible.
Yeah.
So we have to at least acknowledge that maybe we can't be sure. I mean, in other words, I would be most happy for a scientist to say, I trust science more than anything, but I realize science has limits.
Yeah.
And so I'm fine with that. Like, I'm fine with somebody, and many scientists do, by the way. And maybe, one of the things, I guess, a criticism of scientism is people say, the religious side makes too much of it.
Yeah.
Like, we make scientism in something bigger than it is. I can understand that critique a little bit, but it's so pervasive, it's so small, it sort of just is in our culture so much.
Yeah. I was thinking also, well, actually, there was something that you said it very fast, but it was so important I think we should emphasize it. there's a in terms of knowledge and evidence, of course, when you have all the evidence of what is happening with reality, as we said, mathematics, logics, mechanism, patterns, human beings, brains, consciousness, therefore this points towards a mind, a creator of reality, who would say, okay, that's a huge jump. Or it is actually the same jump that a person could make from evolution to atheism. Like these two things belong to two different realms of thinking. They don't have anything to do with each other. But the conversation goes again to the fact that human beings, we need to have some metaphysical foundation to the things that we do, even if we don't recognize it. You know, if someone asks me about meaning, and I am, for example, in the past I was an atheist, they would ask me about meaning. Well, I make my own meaning. You see, there's something I worship. It's me. It's evolution. It's something. There's always something there, and another point that I would like to make about this conversation that is interesting before we finish the conversation is when Christian thinkers and Christianity in general talks about science, it seems always like people think that it is Christianity or Christian faith and science, but that's not the way Christianity has thought about this. We think about, let's put it in a very simple terms, like there's a context, which is the reality of God, and science is just something inside that is not in a position. It's just parts of a way to understand what God has made. So when people oppose the two ideas of faith and science, and both cannot coexist, it's very weird for me. It was weird even when I was an atheist. I was thinking, yeah, you can think this, you can study reality, but once you have reality, what do you do with it? I mean, people have questions about everything. So, like, we don't think that there's I don't think that there's any opposition. In fact, I like thinking always, Ian, in these terms, like science, love, conversations about God all come from the same brain, from the same human, from the same. It is not so. It is very interesting. I'm just saying this because some people might be listening to this conversation, saying, "Okay, so since they're both Christians, they're criticizing science." Not at all. Science is such a beautiful method. I actually understand at certain points, Ian, how some people have said, "Man, science, let's just attach to it because it's so cool." It is. It is something that humanity has been able to develop. That it really gives us such knowledge about reality. So definitely incredible. But of course, when it comes to what happens with science describes everything that has described, and it not only describes things that we see here, but also how do you say this? I always have problems with it. Hypothesizes concerning things that haven't happened yet, that will happen in the future. That is incredible. I mean, that is incredible. But then at the same time, it comes with the question of meaning and the question of why. Those questions, if you eradicate the why question, you would actually go to universities and tear down all departments of literature and arts and music. There wouldn't be any meaning in humanity. So, well, so Ian, thank you very much for spending time with me and with us today. I just would like to ask you one last question. Just kind of a small statement in a minute or two. Do you have any messages for people that, for example, at this moment, this is a question beyond a little bit science and scientism. We have been talking about this, but we have touched a little bit about science and faith. You as a Christian thinker, and also as a scientist, would you share your opinion about how these two coalesce and become something important in your life, and the meaning of that for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing I would want people to know, kind of basically what you expressed, that this whole warfare, but that you have to accept one or the other, is just a dichotomy that's absolutely not true. And it's not just Christians who are saying that either. There's a wonderful book that actually just came out that's just a series of articles by secular, or well, I shouldn't say secular, some of them are Christians, but I mean, they're from secular disciplines across the board, called The Warfare Between Science and Christianity. And at the bottom it says something to the effect, or the warfare between science and religion, the idea that just won't die. And it's by some very famous Ronald Numbers, a wonderful historian, and they have articles in there by basically people who are the top of their different fields. And I guess that was the first thing I would want to say, is that if you really understand the history and philosophy of science and understand the underpinnings of science, there is no war between science and religion. And by the way, we're both guilty of presenting that argument. So the atheists on one side are good at making the war between science and religion a big deal, and the dogmatic Christians, I mean, the camp that that I grew up in, we're just as guilty of creating this sort of warfare that can't be opposed. You either accept one or the other, and I just don't believe that. What I would say is, to me, like, science is a fantastic, wonderful way to understand the world and accumulate knowledge about the physical world. But I would just warn that it has limits. And again, not people can still talk about this. I mean, some very famous Nobel Prize winning scientists have talked about the limits of science. I mean, it's interesting. I use all standard textbooks for my classes, even though I go to a Christian college. It's just normal, and it's interesting to see how each textbook deals with it differently. So I have one that was really good. It specifically lays out, like, here is science, but here's limits. Science can't answer these types of questions, or these. And so I think it's important that we talk about those things with our students. Mm-hmm. Not only because it is true about the limits of science, but it also gives value. I mean, one of the things I love is teaching non-majors. It gives them value in the discipline they're doing. Because if not, I'm telling you, all right, English major, your major is pointless. I don't know why you're wasting your time, right? I mean, there are important aspects to us as a culture and us living together with one another. And what types of questions do those things have that science just doesn't answer? We sort of already mentioned that. So I would basically say to somebody, what I've learned, especially over the last 5 or 6 years in studying these, is there's no warfare between science and religion, no matter what your take is on specific scientific ideas. Mm-hmm. And also that science is important. And one thing I want to really encourage and see is Christians get more involved in science. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, because of this warfare hypothesis that's just not true, many Christians have just left science alone, really to the detriment of even our community. And so that's one of the things I want to try to encourage, is we need to get more involved. And it's helpful to see, again, COVID-19 is a good example. What can science give us that's fantastic, that we need to do? And what are some things that science just can't answer, that we have to look elsewhere for knowledge?
Well, Ian, thank you very much for spending time with me. For all viewers and listeners, you can engage with the conversation. Let us know. Ask us questions. You can do in the comments on the YouTube channel, or you can send questions to me directly at my email, askandwondernashville@gmail.com. This interview you'll see below, and all the descriptions and some of the links of things that have been mentioned during the interview. And Ian, again, thank you. And I look forward to having more conversations with you in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.